this great event with our friends here. And as you've seen, the topic is really to dive a little bit deeper into the kind of ins and outs of different dev data strategies. All of you have probably heard of DORA, of space. You've probably measured all kinds of things in Jira. You've probably looked at cycle time in some way or another. You've probably got angry about it before. You've probably seen it work well sometimes. And this is a discussion where we're really excited to have, because it's something we care a tremendous bunch about. And I think many of you do too. So we're excited to really debug this. So I'm going to jump in here and introduce kind of the topics we're going to focus on, and I'll be kind of steering the conversation with our fantastic guests. We're going to cover why is this stuff important in the first place? Like, why should you really be thinking about it and caring about it? Why do we think that adds value to your workflow and makes your life better? We're going to focus specifically initially on DORA, this framework that so many people are talking about and seems to get more popular every day. But we're not just going to talk about the good parts of it, right? We're going to talk about how can you get this stuff wrong? What are the weaknesses of such a thing? And what do you need to be on the lookout for as someone getting new to it? We're going to talk on a more high level as a CTO, as a VP of engineering, or even as a frontline developer. Like, what does it actually mean to be data-driven? What are the things you should be thinking about? What are the practices that you can get into? Then we're going to leave some time to talk about other metrics, other frameworks, things that you might want to be considering. What else should factor into your strategy as you start to develop more clarity on this? And then as we progress through that conversation, we'll be leaving time for questions. I'll be paying close attention to the time to try and keep us on track here. I'll also be paying close attention to the chat. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to them. So without further ado, I'm going to let all of our panelists introduce themselves here. And then for all of you attending, of course, feel most comfortable to go camera off and muted if you'd like, or you can stay camera on. We do ask that you mute yourself during the initial part of the discussion just to keep the airwaves nice and clear for everybody. But then as we get towards the end, absolutely raise your hands or drop a note, and we'll let you take the floor to dive into the discussion. So, gentlemen, thank you all for joining today. We have such a great cohort here of people with a lot of experience in dev data, a lot of perspective on these frameworks, a lot of experience as leaders in organizations of all shapes and sizes. I'm going to let them introduce themselves rather than me. I'm going to now mute myself and pass the mic to Bryan. Bryan, perhaps a quick 1-minute introduction of yourself, if you're able to, and then we'll just go round on the slide here to Hajong, Krishna, Eric, and then I'll ask the first question and we'll dive into the discussion. Thanks, guys.
I don't know if Bryan's with us.
Oh, maybe Bryan is running behind. So
yeah, Bryan, I don't see him in here, so.
Let's pass the mic then to Hajong. I know we've got Krishna, so and I'll buzz Bryan, make sure he's all right.
I'll let you know as he gets in.
Sounds good. So hello, everyone. My name is Hajong. I'm co-founder and CTO of Miracle, also a proud member of 7CTO. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to be here today. And before I delve into my journey and our discussion topic, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to 7CTOs and to Eric for organizing this wonderful event. I really appreciate the platform for us to learn, share, and collaborate. And moving into my journey into dev data, it really began during my PhD studies in computer science at UC Berkeley. And my research thesis centered around developing an algorithm that could analyze the Git repository and quantify each developer's contribution. The goal back then was to devise an automated way of distribute funding to open source developers according to their varying level of contribution in the project. And the research journey really opened my eyes to a crucial insight, which is simply looking at Git repository isn't enough. The real world of engineering really extends far beyond it, right? Because there are so many complex interactions, complex decisions, and a multitude of activities that occur outside the boundaries of a Git repository. So motivated by this insight, I created open source platform for dev data called Apache DevLake. And it has become one of the most popular open source tools for collecting dev data and extracting insights and metrics like DORA for developer teams. So today, I look forward to sharing some of our stories from the field and get your perspective on this matter as well. I'm going to pass the mic to Krishna.
Awesome. Thanks.
You're on mute, Krishna. Always.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Krishna Kumar. I run a small consulting firm called Think Research. We have a program called the Polaris Advisor Program. The problem we're solving is helping people understand how to use data to improve product development flow in their systems, all the way from ideation to adoption. So it's an end-to-end, very context-specific solution for people to understand what data to use, where to use it, how to actually make continuous improvement programs work with data. And I've been writing software for 30 years. I've done the trenches, did work as developer, architect, CTO, VP of engineering, and all that. And what finally got me into this was in my stints in management, I was mostly just flying blind. And I was like, all right, this has to be done. There's best to be a better way to do this. And so been doing this for about 8 to 10 years now. And we have a fairly powerful bespoke platform that actually covers the whole gamut from product management through engineering through production, and we build fairly customized solutions for companies that actually kind of help them build programs for improving specific aspects of their engineering product development process.
Nice. Welcome, Krishna.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Krishna. And then we've got Bryan. Bryan, thanks for joining.
Good morning, Bryan.
Yeah, sorry I'm a little late. Got distracted on PR. Yes, I'm Bryan Finster. I've been a software developer for nearly 30 years. I have the first experience I had with any kind of metrics at all was trying to, working as how do we actually implement continuous delivery at Walmart. And the experience we had implementing CD led to me getting recruited to start a DevOps dojo at Walmart, focusing on how do we do continuous delivery. Using metrics for that. Also, am kind of responsible for DORA metrics getting published broadly as a thing to look at, and have been focusing for a few years on trying to correct a course on that because people misunderstand the DORA metrics and tell them they should read Appendix A instead of focusing on page 19 of that book. I've been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years talking to different vendors who are building dashboards to give them feedback, because dashboards can be extremely dangerous if misused. I've seen the teams abused by them, which is actually how I met Krishna, as we had one of those conversations. So it's a passion of mine. How do we use these better and use metrics to point to people to how to improve how work is done and find pain and drag in the process instead of using them to blame people, hold them accountable, or compare teams to each other.
Welcome, Bryan.
Thanks.
And hi, good morning, everybody, and maybe good afternoon. I'm Eric Berkfeld. I am part of the 7CTOs community. I've actually been here since day one, and I live in San Diego. And my career has been really just working to build engineering teams and build culture into them. And with that, I always believe that, less mystery, more history. And so when we started to really get metrics, there was a really just a kind of cover lifted off, and we're able to really facilitate a better understanding of how we're doing and why we're doing. And I really thought that started to pull us away from just being, I'm admitting some people here, our other parts of our company looking at our engineering departments as a commodity. And I felt like when you get to really understand the history of what you've done, there's also less of, and I'll use the analogy of my mother, I forget to do something for my mother one day and she's like, you always do that. I'm like, I don't always do that. And with engineering, we put a bug into production, God forbid, but the rest of the company's like, you guys always do that. And with metrics, you can be like, actually, we don't always do that. In fact, if you look back over time, I can show you that we've had no defects over the last 50 days, whatever it is. So I believe in metrics, not only helping ourselves, but helping our companies. And I'm proud to be here, and I'm excited to work with Maxim and Hajong and Krishna and Bryan, welcome, and everybody else that's in here to learn more, to see how you implement it, and really how do we increase this narrative in our everyday. So thank you.
Absolutely. No, we have such a great group here, and something I really want to capture is just the diversity of this panel from a perspectives angle, where we didn't want to pull together just a group of people who were going to just push a single perspective, right? We didn't want people who were just going to say DORA is perfect, there's no limitations to it, no concerns, you guys should do it, and that's that, right? I think there's a healthy kind of variety of experiences and mindsets here that kind of weigh the pros and cons of all of these things in a really balanced way. And it's a group that I'm really happy to have pulled together here today, because I think we're going to have probably one of the more grounded and well-rounded discussions on this topic that I've seen personally. And it's something we've really been paying close attention to. So to kick this off, guys, let's just dive right in with the highest level thing. Why should anyone care about this stuff? If I feel like I'm doing a good job at leading my team, I'm delivering software, my app store ratings are good, no one's complaining, I'm making money, I don't want to look at the bureaucracy around this stuff. Like, why does it matter? And maybe, Bryan, if you're up for it, I'll kick it over to you to start that discussion.
Yeah, I was just literally having this conversation with my old SVP. I've been doing, up until 2017, I was doing supply chain software for my entire career. What we're looking at here is the supply chain of how do we get an idea to an end user and get feedback as fast as possible. And if you don't have any visibility into your supply chain, then you can feel like you're doing great, until a competitor comes and does it better. Coming from I spent 19 years at Walmart, and Walmart's not a retail company, they're a supply chain company. And the reason that they're Fortune 1 is because they're focused on optimizing their supply chain. And you need that visibility. You need to understand what metrics to measure, why, and what we're trying to discover so that we can optimize their supply chains.
Absolutely. And Krishna, I see you nodding your head there. Like, how would you articulate it? You talk with plenty of people. Like, why should anyone really care about measuring this stuff in the first place?
So I mean, definitely second what Bryan just said. But the bigger picture is we need better tools to reason about how our systems work, right? So we have, a lot of people are convinced that, software development is this, what they call chaotic, complex, dynamic environment that you cannot reason about, and all you can do is kind of empirically observe it and experience it and all that. It's all nonsense, right? I mean, it's mostly because we haven't spent enough time and the sort of rigor building a discipline around how a software system is supposed to work, and then understand how to demonstrate those behaviors using data, and then figure out how to use data to consistently move things from where they should not be to where they should be, right? That continuous improvement program is impossible without data, because you can all claim that you're great, everyone is awesome, everyone is above average, but that's not true, right? So I think, to me, data is like it's not just a nice thing to have; it's essential if you're ever going to have a shot at actually digging ourselves out of the hole, our industries. And so I clearly feel strongly about it. So.
Absolutely. And Hajong, I always value your perspective on this too, not just because we're collaborators and friends, but I think you've thought a lot about this, and you've also been part of growing a team from one person basically when I joined to a much larger team today. How do you think about this stuff? What's the value of metrics in the engineering discussion?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Maxim. And for me, I think it's sort of a cliche, but there's an analogy I really like about metrics, which is, venturing into the world of engineering is much like embarking on a vast ocean, right? Our goal here is to, navigate those waters, weather the storms, and chart a course that will take us to destination. And I think metrics play two important roles in this journey. First, metrics are our compass, right? It basically help us stay oriented, pointing out the right direction amidst the storms of engineering complexity. So if we need to improve, speed or quality, or if we need to foster better collaboration within our crew, now our metric compass guides us, where to steer our ship. Secondly, I think metrics are our sentinel, right? They are on the lookout day and night for any signs of trouble and keeping an eye out for those, dangerous iceberg or stormy clouds. Let's say if our code quality slips, or if our deployment frequency drops, or if our, system stability wavers, then it's the metric sentinel that raises the alarm. So the sooner we know about these issues, the quicker we can take action to correct the course and then keep our ship sailing smoothly. So compass and sentinel, I think that's why I think this is important for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if there's anything that I feel I've learned from just chatting with so many people about this and being part of those discussions, it's this basic idea, right, that if you're burning too many calories on gut instinct and hunting around for things, like you're inevitably going to prevent yourself from doing the high impact work and focusing on where the challenges really are, like figuring out where that 80-20 rule is applying. And it's always been my impression that that's ultimately where the value is, right? Is that the metrics aren't a silver bullet. They're not going to solve your problems, probably not even close, right? But what they are going to do is empower you as a leader to figure out like where are those really high ROI focus areas where you can start to drill in and say, okay, for whatever reason, we're either better or worse or more volatile in this particular aspect of our code quality, delivery process, whatever it is you're measuring. And it really, like the part that always excites me when we get into that part of the discussion effectively is you start to see that it's freeing people to do their best work, right? You're not spending so much time playing detective. You're not playing so much time kind of hunting around, having pointless discussions, wasting people's time with meetings that have no particular purpose. And you can really focus on what matters. So for me, that's a big part of what I really love about it.
You know what I love about it too is
yeah,
it's one of the easiest sells, right? So if you bring in a new process, you bring in a new, paradigm, a new discipline, sometimes it's a hard sell to your team. But if you bring in metrics, I feel like you just as you said, Maxim, it forces everybody to do, not forces, but they want to do their best work. So it's declarative of where I was and where I'm going. So I love easy sells.
I've seen really mixed outcomes from that. I mean, honestly, it depends on the culture of the organization you're in. We had like metrics exposed at Walmart, and it was a hard sell getting managers to look at it. Some teams really cherished those and used them. Other teams feared them, and it was all based on the culture of the area of that organization. So I wouldn't say it's an easy sell. It just depends.
Well, I think more teams definitely, and I think that also metrics exposes inefficiencies, obviously, right? So some people, yeah, I can see that, and I specifically meant on the engineering team. Yes, the management sell to executive. That can be a hard sell because it's slowdown of work, in the beginning.
I mean, I think that what I found is like I do this. This is one of the big things I do, right? So I think when I have to talk to CEOs, I have to talk to engineers, and so on and so forth. And the main thing is the story that you tell with the metrics, right? So it's not the metrics themselves. It is what point are you trying to make? If you say that there's a problem, you can say there's a problem, and you can say that there's a problem and back it up with data. There's two different things, right? And I think that when you have the latter and you can actually back it up, it's actually a much more convincing argument, right? You might end up have people argue that this metric is not the right thing, but those are easier arguments to have, right? If you can actually tell the story and saying, okay, here's why we're doing this, and here's the evidence that tells you that there is a problem, and here's how we can fix it. That story is more important than any number you present.
absolutely. So, of course, the big topic du jour, I feel like it's the trendy set of metrics, certainly has been for a while, and from our perspective continues to be, is good old DORA. And of course, I think that's something that brings a lot of people to this discussion. I think it's certainly a robust foundation to get started with this stuff. Leading into that discussion, my personal view on it is a big part of what I love about it is that it is kind of sufficiently simple, that it's relatively easy to share and to communicate and understand. And I think it's sufficiently abstract where it's not going to really like perversely drive like gaming behaviors, right? Like people can't necessarily game change failure rate, right? It's like, it is what it is. And if you're improving change failure rate, probably a good thing on the whole. So I love those things about it. And I'd really love to have you guys riff on it a bit as kind of the key kind of starting point for lots of these dev data discussions people seem to be having. And I'll kind of pass the mic around. I have kind of a specific question for each of you guys to dive into. Krishna, I'd love for you to kick us off, really talking about like, how would you personally describe DORA perhaps to someone who's new to it, and what do you kind of see as its core merits? Then I want to pass it to Hajong. Hajong, for you to dive in afterwards. The question I have for you is like, if it's so great and it's so useful, like why isn't everyone doing it? Like what are the core challenges? And then Bryan, I always love your perspective on this stuff to kind of pull the discussion into a bigger point. I'd love for you to kick us off after that on like, what are the ways that people do get this framework right and wrong? Like what are the guidances that you would give to someone to make sure like, great, you're implementing DORA, you could do this well, but how do you make sure you don't screw it up? So Krishna, let's have you kick it off. Like, how would you describe this? What is this thing, and why is it something someone should be looking at?
All right. So I think I want to be careful and distinguish between DORA, the DevOps program, and DORA, the metrics. I think that's something that is worth talking about. The DevOps program, the larger DevOps program, is really about improving the flow of value and work all the way from the top of the value stream until it gets to production, right? And I think that if you look at it, read accelerate, as Bryan says, and not reach just page 19, if you actually look at the whole book, it's about that whole system, right? And the DORA metrics happen to be one area in that book where people actually did some quantification that was measurable and so on and so forth, and they're very valuable. But really, DORA metrics is talking about the path to production, right? And the path to production, if you think in terms of value, is where the work is functionally complete, and you want to get things into production as fast as possible and as quick, smaller batches as possible, simply because not doing so increases deployment risk, it increases time to feedback, and a whole bunch of things, right? So the DORA metrics are very, very useful, very stable framework to assess both, the time, the unnecessary non-value added delays on the path to production, as well as how efficiently and stably you're actually sort of getting work that is finished that should not be sitting around into production as quickly as possible, right? And that's the function of DORA metrics within this larger framework. But I think you have to always keep that in mind.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's really well said, and certainly one of the ways I like to articulate it, right? It's just figuring out like, how are you delivering it and how do you do that more stably, more sustainably? Like,
right. And it's all non-value added time. So, if you think about it, any time that you're spending there is completely non-value added. So there's really no reason you should be doing it. If you have a real good reason to do it, let's figure out what it is and figure out why not to do that.
Absolutely. And something I always think about, and Hajong, it's the question I would love for you to kick us off on. Bryan, Krishna, and Eric, certainly feel free to dive into it. But I think maybe in the back of everybody's minds, right, is like, okay, like this framework sounds good. People I respect seem to be talking positively about it. They're doing it. But if it's so good and it's easy, like, why isn't everybody doing it? Like, what are the challenges to diving into this stuff? Like, why isn't everybody doing this?
So in terms of the challenges, I think there are high-level challenges and low-level challenges. On the high level, I think building trust is probably the most difficult step in implementing DORA. As I think Bryan also touched on this, one pattern that we have seen is, there's like a VP of engineering reaching out to us and interested in using DevLake to implement DORA for their team. We had a great chat, right? The next conversation, he bring all of his managers to the conversation, and then we get grilled over all those questions on, why are we doing this? Is this trustworthy? Is this measuring the right metric for our team? Everyone is worried and not really trusting this new initiative, right? So I think building the trust is really the first step. It's really the trust between the managers and this tool, the developers and the tools, and also the managers and the VP of engineering who's pushing this initiative forward, making sure we are all on the same page of this is what we want to measure, this is what we want to improve. So that's the high-level challenge, the trust part. The low-level challenge, I think, is more on the tooling side, where this is not rocket science, right? It's really just getting the data from the data source, process the data, transform data, compute those metrics. But it can really be a tedious process for the teams, because the team can easily, go with maybe 10 DevOps tools in their tech stack, like GitHub for code hosting, Jira for issue tracking, Circle CI for CI, Argo CD for CD, and PagerDuty for incident management, right? And they need to get all this data and then also localize this data to their team's practice, because every team is different. Every team defines deployment and incident differently. And that process can take, if not months, but weeks to implement on the team themselves, in addition to the work they need to do on a daily basis. So I think these are the two challenges I see when it comes to implementing DORA on the high level and low level stuff.
Absolutely. No, and obviously, Hezhang, you and I have seen no shortage of people who have like the best intentions, and they're giving themselves migraine after migraine and bad day after bad day, wrestling with spreadsheets, trying to pull this stuff together. And this is as promotional as I will let this conversation get. Solving that challenge is exactly why we built DevLake as an open source solution. So if you guys want something that's free, want something that is open source and transparent, we have something worth looking at, and I'll leave it at that. And if it's interesting, give me a buzz. Bryan,
and I'll promote it too, because, so that you don't have to promote it yourself. Both Bryan and I have built systems like this. We continue to build them, and it is somewhat rocket science if that's not your primary job, right? I mean, it is a lot of work, and I think that the reason I was excited about DevLake was exactly the fact that it's open source. And the fact that it is actually solving a real problem, that is the plumbing, and most people don't have efficient plumbing to actually get the data in the first place, and cleaning it up, getting it right. It is work, and I know how hard it is because I've done it. So yeah, there, try it.
Maxim, I have a question, and really for Bryan and Krishna too. I think one of the other challenges is consistency, right? So it's you got to build this trust. You do all this work. You got a VP of engineering or a CTO or an engineering manager. It's like, I know why we want to do this, and you even get buy-in from your team. It's always a tough road to hoe, like when you're trying to go upstream and get buy-in from executives. But let's say you get it. If everybody doesn't commit to that and continuously look and make sure data's in, it dies a horrible death. And then you get a bad taste in your mouth. And so that's one of the things that I've seen, not just with metrics, but even other, process changes, that if you can't get the consistent buy-in, and that's tough. That's a lot of work. So, when it's easy as far as implementation or access to that data, great. But keeping your team, enthused is another.
Yeah, I want to touch on that after but I do want to talk a little bit about the DORA metrics. One of the big challenges is that people don't look at them in context, and it's in the context of the book. And the reality is that so number one, I totally agree with what the book's trying to say because of my experience with continuous delivery. But the hypothesis behind the book is that continuous delivery improves outcomes for the entire organization. And if you look at what they're doing with DORA metrics, they're trying to correlate organizations that are high performing with organizations that are doing continuous delivery. And those DORA metrics are only measuring continuous delivery. And they're not even, but they're not actually metrics. They're responses to survey questions that were sent out to thousands of people, right? And some of them aren't actually measurable if you try to instrument them in a way that's useful. I'll give you an example. MTTR is actually, if you go to the DORA community, they're trying to come up with some other way of measuring that particular thing they're trying to get an answer to, because the signal to noise ratio in MTTR, if you actually try to instrument it, is so high as to be worthless. The change fail rate is another one. So I wrote a paper, and I'll send a link out later, called How to Misuse and Abuse DORA Metrics, that I dive deep into this. But like, change fail rate is a really useful metric if you actually read what the book says about change fail rate. And if you read it, the answer is it's any defect that leaks to production. It doesn't have to be an incident. And I've seen this measured all sorts of different ways by different people, where they try to tie it to an incident, they try to tie it to a particular change, which is almost impossible if you're doing any sort of continuous delivery for real. But you need to understand what they're trying to measure. They're trying to measure that, number one, we're deploying small batches, we're doing it with a high level of quality. And then if you go to what they call the hard lead time, which is the cycle time of the pipeline, that may be an important thing to track if your pipeline takes 4 days because you have a testing team and all these other things downstream of development. But if your pipeline lasts for 3 hours, that's too long, but that's not going to be your constraint in your flow. I mean, there's other metrics you want to look at. In the talk I gave on this, I talk about that there's not 4 DORA metrics. If you read the book, I came up with 14, and that was without even trying. There's all these different aspects, to Krishna's point, and it's an entire system of delivery. DORA metrics are not a silver bullet. Some of them can't be instrumented or give you useful data. What you need to look at is, how do we measure that we're delivering very small, decreasing our batch size while improving our quality and being able to respond to incidents quickly. We need to figure out a set of metrics that work in our environment that we can actually track to measure that, right? But I think it's important to understand that. Going back to the point of instrumenting these things, I too have built dashboards. I was the original product owner for our metric solution for the Walmart platform. I've built an open source solution for the Air Force that it's still being developed and used. In fact, I was told the Army wants it this morning. And it's not easy, especially when you start pulling in metrics from workflow tools, because the way that people organize things, the level of value a team may or may not have, the workflow data, means you're not going to get good flow metrics unless everybody's working the same way. And as far as adoption goes, we managed to get broad adoption at Walmart. When I left, we had something like 9,000 dashboards out there on a single instance, collecting data and rolling that up to the VP level. But the way we did that was we had tie-ins to the rest of the systems to auto onboard people. The only people that care about metrics are the people who actually care, or the people that are incentivized to care. So we publish the data by auto onboarding everybody, and because if you created a pipeline, you were going to get onboarded to all the metrics. And then the CTO had this goal out there to drive interest in caring. I really need every team to be able to deliver to production daily. And doing that as a method, I talk about this frequently, about how that's a method of, instead of, hey, we're going to do enterprise transformation or DevOps transformation or Agile transformation, outcomes. If I can't deliver daily, then I'm not Agile. The act of learning how to do that improves both engineering excellence and business outcomes. But we had to have the metrics to get that done. And so it's asking for the right things, making sure you understand what each one of these metrics are for, not just blindly applying them. And then again, how do we get the tooling in place to actually collect them in a meaningful way so that it's useful?
Absolutely. I think that's really well said, Bryan. And I know something that's very near and dear to your heart, and I think to all of us here on this call, is like we want to be pro developer, right? We don't want these things to be weaponized. We don't want them to become things people hate. We don't want them to become surveillance tools, punishment tools. I'd love to kind of take the conversation in that direction and have all of you guys kind of riff on this. Like, what's the advice you would give to an engineering leader who has good intent, right? Like they want to introduce these kind of metrics. They want to build a better process. They want to figure out where those bottlenecks are, and they want to define success. They want to communicate to other teams, all of that good stuff. But how can they make sure they're not going to turn this into a problem? What would
I have a specific example I want to talk about that I think is amazing. Okay. And I'm going to name names. Vinod, the CTO for Sam's Club. And I found this out after I left, so I'm not violating an NDA. So Vinod, the CTO for Sam's Club, he came in and started doing this metrics-driven approach to improvement. And when he found out that some managers were using those metrics to compare teams to each other and shame people, he came down on those managers like a ton of bricks. I recently was told that teams in Sam's Club are eager to demonstrate how they're doing as far as improving their flow of delivery, because Vinod has worked so hard to establish that level of trust. In that same talk about misusing and abusing DORA metrics, I have this whole infographic about how the different metrics relate to each other. And then one of the things that's underlying that is don't measure anything unless you have created a culture of trust, learning, and improvement. You need that in place, or you need to build that for the metrics to be useful.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in? All right.
Absolutely.
Again, I think that the key thing to do is understand clearly what your goals are, right? So I think before you even talk about metrics, before you even talk about what to measure, you have to understand why you are measuring, and have to have a clear articulation of the problem you're trying to solve. And if you can't do that, then I would say don't start measuring anything, right? So if you actually have a business problem, people think it takes too long to ship, your customers are complaining, or your product managers are thinking that our roadmap is not getting done. It's a real problem, and you got to work backwards from that. Okay, is the problem in engineering? It's a problem in product management, right? And eventually, once you sort of have a hypothesis on what the problem is, that's when you start collecting data, right? And so you have to sort of work from the problem, understand what signals you need to measure, and then figure out, can you even measure these? And sometimes the measurements are not system measurements. Sometimes you just have to ask people. You can run surveys and so on and so forth, right? I saw a question about DX360, and I think this is exactly related to that, right? In general, what you're interested in is getting the right set of information to solve that problem. Some of them may be instrumentable from your systems. Some of them may be instrumental by talking to people. But for every problem, you need a custom panel to say, okay, well, here's the data I think will help me solve this problem, right? That's the way we do it in my program. We have, we have a template for this. We look for certain goals. But the idea is that whenever you have a problem, you don't start with the metrics. You go and figure out, okay, well, how do I frame this as a problem that can be solved by metrics, first of all? And sometimes it's not, and so the metrics are not the point. I mean, the metrics are not particularly important. What you need to do is to see what problem you're solving, and once you can present that to people, then trust becomes a lot easier, right? Because you know exactly why they're being measured, and maybe people don't agree with the reason why they're being measured. That's a bigger problem. But assuming that these are for good reasons, you have transparency about what these metrics are doing, how they're being used, and what outcomes you expect to be able to do. And so in general, the way I do it in my program is we focus things around specific improvements, right? We have this big machine that lets us collect all sorts of data, but any given company or any given team or any given context will need maybe like a fraction of those in a particular way, right? And so we set it up so that we can solve problems with data, right? As opposed to here's a set of metrics, and let's see what those metrics mean. That's working backwards from the metrics. That make sense?
Is really well said, Krishna. And I think if there's anything that has really been a common theme through lots of this discussion that I really want to emphasize, it's that much like a good science experiment, right? Sometimes this stuff does really require a good hypothesis, a good question that's well defined, right? And I think one example I'd give of how I've seen this be tremendously successful, in fact, with a 7CTOs member who's using DevLake, they came to the discussion with a really clear goal where they were doing some fairly major architecture changes. And one of the key things they wanted to validate or invalidate was, will these architecture changes reduce our change failure rate and improve our stability? And they had a really specific set of metrics that they could then pay attention to say, okay, is this working or not? And it's the cultural piece too, which I think is important, where there was no part of that discussion that's saying, hey, we want these metrics because if this is going wrong, we need to fire these guys, or we need to yell at this guy or something, right? It was very well intended, very focused, very like practical of saying, our high level goal is this. There's some metrics that can tell us if we're in the right direction or not. Now we can go do this in a way that's going to make sense. And I think it's just like science, right? It begins with a great hypothesis, and that's going to drive the success.
And what I find, Maxim, is the number of people who actually approach it this way is relatively small. So I think, a lot of the time in my engagements, I educate people, right, on what metrics to use, why you're using them. Most people want to give me the 3 metrics I need to use, and I'm like, well, can't do that, right? So I think the level of sophistication in terms of our general knowledge in terms of metrics in our industry as a whole is fairly low, right? And I think that even among relatively sophisticated people, you find a lot of like copy and paste.
You get asked for 3 metrics. I kept having SVPs asking me for the 1 metric to look at.
The 1 metric, yeah, the 1 metric is what I usually get. But you can talk them down to 3, maybe. So.
Absolutely. One of the analogies I love to use, and it segues nicely into the next question I have, and for you guys to think about it while I say my piece here, is would love to hear your perspectives on what it means to be a data-driven engineering organization. Like, what does that even mean? And one of the ways that I've personally liked to think about that and articulate it is that you go into a cockpit of a Boeing 747 and you see all those instruments. That's data-driven piloting, right? It's not like they're focused on the wrong things and they're not paying attention to every single one of those metrics 100% of the time. But they have that telemetry to be able to say, like, what is the wind speed? What's the ground speed? What's the altitude? What's the temperature? What's the engine speed? And if something feels off or something's maybe not going quite according to plan, or I want to verify that we're on course or flying safely, I can look at these different instruments to determine yes or no. And I always like to say, like, if you're being a data-driven engineering leader, you're being like a data-driven pilot, right? Like, you're piloting a complex, expensive, important machine. And you're going to need to find ways to understand if things are working and to what extent. So I love to pitch it that way. But I'd love to have you guys riff on that topic. Like, what does it mean to be a data-driven engineering leader or organization in the first place?
I'll take that one. And before that, I want to just echo on Krishna's point of start with a problem, right, that you want to solve. And I just want to add to that, which is start small. Maybe start with 1 problem with a few metrics, and that's balanced, right? Because I think that's part of the beauty of DORA, which is it's simple and it's balanced. So one anti-pattern we have seen there is, like, one guy set up DevLake, get all the metrics, and he's excited with the wealth of information, right? And then he showed this dashboard of 20 metrics to his team, and everybody gets scared because nobody understands this 20 metrics, what we're doing here, what each one means. And so that's, I think, an anti-pattern we want to avoid, which is start with 1 problem that you want to solve, start with a few metrics that are balanced, because if it isn't balanced, you're trying to measure, you're trying to optimize for speed, then people might just bloat out the lines of code that you have, right? That's going to be bad for your quality. So I think that's something I want to add to. I think Krishna's brilliant point. I'll start with a problem you try to solve. Also try to start small. Yeah. Cool. And also, sorry, getting back to Maxim's question, what means to be a data-driven organization? I think my thought there is to really get into a habit of asking yourself, how do we measure the success? At the end of this improvement period, how do we prove that we actually achieved our goal? And in answering that question, you will naturally get to the question of what metric should we use? What data do we use to prove the point? I think that's where to start for being a data-driven organization.
It's like TDD for continuous change, right? So you first figure out, how will you verify whether what you've changed is actually working? And then you make the change. And then if you have the measurements, then your test will be green. And so metrics are a theory is critical. I mean, a theory of how you think your change will impact something is critical. And then that theory, if you can measure it, lets you validate or verify that you're making progress or not. And I think the piece I like a lot about Gene Kim's article on the 3 ways of DevOps, the third way of DevOps is a culture of continuous experimentation, right? And ultimately, I think what you want is the teams themselves to be empowered to experiment, build their own metrics, build their own contextual stuff. But I think what is currently missing, I think, is a consistent, well-understood theory of how these systems are supposed to work. So we tend to believe that we measure DORA metrics because, as Bryan said, it impacts business performance. I mean, that's just too far. The causal link is just way, way too far, and it's it's not necessary but not sufficient, right? But the problem is that most people start out with a negative notion of metrics. The first thing you see when you talk about metrics is, somebody's going to stack rank me, or somebody's going to do something bad to me, right? And we have that negative notion as part of a large part of our culture, and that's the way software industry has grown up, right? So I think that's going to be part of something you have to fight, and you got to educate people, you got to talk about it, and it's going to take time.
Yeah, and I'll say that you can a good indication whether you're a data-driven organization or not is to just reiterate what Krishna said. It's not that we have dashboards. It's we're doing hypothesis-driven development, and then we are actually collecting the results at the end and comparing it to our hypothesis. That we're not just kind of throwing stuff down the pipeline and assuming it's a good product decision. Start there. Are we making good business decisions, and how are we measuring that? And then how do we do that more efficiently?
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, and something I love that you guys really centered on, which I think is such a key takeaway too. And Bryan, I love that phrase of hypothesis-driven development. I don't know if you coined that, but I'm gonna.
No, that's like if you go look at continuous delivery, the book at level 5 maturity is hypothesis-driven development.
I love it. I'll be following up on reading into that for sure. And a thread in all of this that I think is such a key practical takeaway is basically be targeted about what you want to pay attention to, and do your best to pick only one at a time, right? If you don't want to turn it into a mess, if you focus on one thing, you'll be able to see that kind of binary outcome. Is it moving in a good or bad way, right? And good or bad is going to depend on what you're measuring, of course. But I think that is truly so crucial to avoid getting into a mess. And Tatiana in the chat asked a great question that I'd love to pass to you guys here, which maybe talks to the kind of soft skills involved in doing this stuff, which is, how do you get people to start paying attention to that story that the data is telling? How do you get them to come to the table? So let's say you've got this fabulous dashboard set up and running, your developers believe in it, you're focused on the right things, you're finding some traction there. But what advice would you give to get people to actually come to the table, whether it's perhaps someone in another department, or it's your counterpart on the product team, or you're talking to people at the board, whatever it is, right? You want people to come to that discussion and buy into it too. What would be kind of the advice you'd give those people to make that work?
What do they need? Right? I mean, what are their problems? It's not you should pay attention to this because I think it's valuable. What problems do you have? And does this help solve your problem?
Yeah.
And that, I mean, it's honestly, it applies to everything, you know, just as an unmetrics related example. I had, you know, I went and talked to somebody from compliance who was really angry at us because we'd automated ServiceNow in our pipeline. And she wanted CAB because two sets of eyes in every change. It's like, well, but what is it you need? Do you need CAB or do you need sets of eyes in every change? And the answer was the second one. I was like, well, yeah, but we can automate validation for that in the pipeline. And that would satisfy your control even better. You know, it's like learning what they need instead of providing solutions to them to problems you don't understand.
Right. And it's very context specific as well. You know, I think it's very context specific. And storytelling is a skill. I mean, it's sales. I mean, you know, as an engineer who's learning to sell, you know, this is a completely different ballgame. And I think you're right. It starts with understanding the customer's problem and figuring out how to tell the story in ways that resonate with the customer. And it's not trivial. I mean, it's a learned skill. And I think, you know, as engineers, I think we have a harder time doing that. You know, we think, well, this is self-evident. I mean, I made that mistake for years, right? This is self-evident. You should just use this because it's logical. You know, no, it doesn't work. It has to be emotional. You have to understand somebody's pain points. So yeah, there's a lot of psychology in this, and there's a lot of like qualitative stuff. You know, as I've learned, as I've turned this business into a consulting business, you know, that's why it's become, those are the challenges. The technology is not the hard part, right? The metrics are not the hard part. The communications, being able to sort of empathize with the problems the users have and understand why, you know, and obviously present the right metrics, but I mean, but you know, understand how they will perceive it and their benefits, and yeah, so it's a hard problem, you know.
I mean, but that's all a product development, right? I mean, if the end user doesn't find your solution valuable, it's not their fault.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's a very fair point you bring up there, Bryan, which to get people engaged, like you want to figure out like what are the pain points that different teams are feeling, and how can you maybe map some of this stuff to be the solve for that, or at least move in the right direction. And I think one of the things that I've personally found, like if I had to personally say, like, what's the value of data in engineering? How does it make people's lives better? My simple answer to that would be, it helps you to communicate across teams what the trade-offs are and what the costs and benefits are to those team decisions. And I think one of the things I've found to be so impactful, right? Let's just say in a hypothetical that you've got a CEO who's angry that customer complaints are higher than he feels they should be. And then your product team is saying like, hey, well, one of the reasons is like, we're super buggy. There's always outages and people get pissed off about it. And maybe you as the engineering leader can then start to put the pieces of the puzzle together to say, one of our goals is to improve those customer ratings. Product's telling us in one of their teams that they need to reduce the bugginess of this stuff. But we have 4 product teams, and 3 out of 4 are constantly pushing us to release new features, and we're doing that. And we're doing it successfully, but the trade-off is we're releasing more buggy stuff. Now, if you guys want to have that conversation that we need to reduce those bugs, it means maybe we need to prioritize that technical debt. It means maybe we got to slow the tempo on feature release. But now we can have that conversation in a really coherent way to say,
oh, he froze. I would also, I'd hate to slow down feature release. I'd like to put more focus on the quality process.
going in, yeah.
Well, listen, I will step in here as Maxim is frozen, and it's not a terrible face. So listen, I know we're at time, everybody, and this has been super awesome. I'd love to do this again, and thanks for the questions in channel. This has really been awesome. What I'd like to do is, I know that Maxim put in chat a link to the Slack, their Slack channel, so we can continue conversation. If everybody should have my email, if not, I can put it in here really quick into chat. What I would say is, if you have any further questions, or would like to see more of this, please reach out to me. Oops, I said that to Maxim directly, everyone. Here we go. And also, I'd like to say this really quickly for everybody in here that is part of the 7CTOs community. One of the efforts that we're going to be running here starting very shortly is we are going to be doing a pilot program. And we're going to be looking at companies within to adopt this whole process and see what it looks like to get this off the ground and get going. It's also being able to look at our continuous improvement as an organization. So how do we help each other to do better? And part of and I'll get more in detail on the pilot, reach out to me directly. But the suffice it to say in the short story is that we're going to bubble up some metrics from you that you think you're willing to, look at and make public. And we're going to look at the before and after. What's the lift to get there? What was the sentiment prior? How did you win over everybody? How did you roll that out? Everything that goes into that. So please reach out to me, and this will be starting up shortly and will culminate hopefully at our 0111 conference here in November. I'm really excited to do this. Zhang, you've been great. Krishna, Bryan, thank you so much for your time. Please, I'll reach out to Maxim and thank him for being an amazing moderator. Beth, thanks for putting this together, and everybody else that joined. I hope you have a great day and smile often.
And Eric, real quick, I was going to say, I did drop a link to the paper I wrote for IT Revolution on how
Excellent.
to misuse and abuse DORA metrics if anyone's interested. I know it's long, but there's a bunch.
That's right. I have ChatGPT to sum it up.
And Bryan, we're going to post the recording of this for our members, and I will grab all of the links that are in the chat and make sure I include that.
Absolutely.
Again.
Thank you so much, Beth.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody. Have a great
Bye.
day.
Thanks, guys.
Take
Good
care.
to see you, Bryan.
You too, Krishna.